Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, November 12, 1944. When 71-year-old Mabel Cordwell walked into the office of attorney Vivian Breslow, her hands trembled so violently that the note she extended rustled like dead leaves in a winter wind. On the paper, the old woman had written just 3 words: "He'll kill me." Vivian looked up at her visitor, gaunt, wearing a threadbare wool coat, with dark circles under her eyes from sleepless nights. "Who's going to kill you?" asked the 26-year-old attorney, gesturing toward the chair across from her oak desk. Mabel sat down, clutched her gnarled fingers together, and whispered, "My cousin Morton. Only now, I'm not sure he really is my cousin." Vivian Breslow had been practicing law for only 4 years, but she'd already earned a reputation as someone who didn't turn away people with nowhere else to go. Her office on the 4th floor of the Allegheny building on Smithfield Street was cluttered with case files, law books, and letters from clients who couldn't afford the fancy downtown firms. The brass nameplate on her door read, quote, 3, in simple block letters. She'd paid for it herself when she opened the practice in 1940, fresh from Duquesne University School of Law, one of only 3 women in her graduating class. This cold November morning, she'd been expecting to prepare for a divorce hearing, but Mabel Cordwell had arrived without an appointment, and the terror in her eyes was so raw that Vivian pushed aside everything else. She'd learned early in her practice that sometimes the most important cases walked through the door unannounced, carried by people who had exhausted every other option and were clinging to their last shred of hope. "Tell me from the beginning," she said gently, pouring the old woman coffee from the percolator on the filing cabinet. The coffee was strong and bitter. She'd been reusing the grounds to save money. But it was hot, and that seemed to matter more. Mabel wrapped both hands around the cup as if warming herself, though the office was heated by a hissing radiator in the corner. Her story had begun 8 months earlier, in March of 1944. Mabel lived alone in a 2-bedroom apartment on Liberty Avenue in Bloomfield, in a brick building that had been constructed before the Great War. Her husband Howard had died in 1937 from complications of black lung disease after 30 years working in the coal yards. She had no children. 2 miscarriages in the 1920s had ended those hopes, and no family either, or so she'd believed her entire life. Loneliness pressed down on her like a physical weight. The apartment felt cavernous without Howard. The neighbors were kind enough, but everyone was busy with war work or rationing or worrying about sons and husbands overseas. Mabel filled her days with small tasks: mending, knitting socks for the Red Cross, listening to the radio. But the silence was crushing. She subscribed to the Pittsburgh Press, and one day in early March came across a section called Seeking Connections. People placed notices there, some looking for pen pals, others hoping to find distant relatives scattered by the Depression and the war. Mabel, hardly understanding why, had written a small advertisement. She'd sat at her kitchen table with a pencil and a piece of Howard's old stationery, writing and rewriting until she had something that didn't sound too desperate. ___, quote __, 6___. She'd mailed it with $2 for the listing fee, then tried to forget about it, certain nothing would come of it. The response came 2 weeks later. A letter from Harrisburg, written in neat, careful handwriting on cream-colored paper. The writer identified himself as Morton Cordwell, 46 years old, who claimed to be Mabel's first cousin. He explained that his father Eugene and Mabel's father Walter had been brothers, but the families had lost touch after Walter moved to Pittsburgh in 1905 to work in the steel mills. Morton wrote that he'd been searching for lost family members for years, ever since his own father had died in 1938 and left him with boxes of old letters and photographs. He enclosed 3 photographs, old, faded snapshots, supposedly showing their common ancestors. One showed a stern-faced couple standing in front of a wooden house, the woman in a high-necked dress, the man with a thick mustache. On the back, someone had written, ___, quote, _7, ___. Another showed a young man in a suit, unsmiling. ___, quote, _8, ___. The inscription read. The third was a group photo, blurred with age, showing several people at what looked like a church picnic. Mabel didn't recognize the faces, but the names matched those she remembered from her mother's stories. Her mother, Ida, had told her about Samuel and Rebecca, about how they'd owned a small farm in Greene County, about how Walter had left home as a young man to seek his fortune in the city. The photographs seemed to confirm it all. Morton wrote warmly, like family, asking about her health and life, expressing regret that they'd been strangers for so long. Mabel's heart swelled. Finally, she had someone who was blood. She wrote back immediately, telling Morton about her life, about Howard, about her quiet days in Pittsburgh. The correspondence grew warmer with each exchange. Morton's letters arrived every week, full of questions and stories. He told her about his work as a foreman at a defense plant in Harrisburg, about how he'd never married, about how he'd always felt the absence of family. The correspondence lasted 6 weeks. In his 5th letter, Morton mentioned that he'd recently been laid off from his job. Cutbacks, he explained, now that the war seemed to be winding down and defense production was slowing. The plant had let go of 30 men, and he'd been among them despite his seniority. He was looking for new opportunities, perhaps in Pittsburgh where industry was still strong. In his 6th letter, he proposed visiting Pittsburgh to meet his quote, _9__, as he called her, and perhaps to look for work. Mabel was delighted. She wrote back immediately, insisting that he must stay with her, that she had plenty of room, that it would be wonderful to have family in the house again. In early May 1944, Morton arrived on the afternoon train from Harrisburg. Mabel met him at Pennsylvania Station, standing on the platform in her best dress, clutching her purse nervously. Morton Cordwell stepped off the train carrying a battered suitcase and a paper bag. He was a tall, thin man with graying hair combed back from a high forehead and attentive brown eyes that crinkled when he smiled. He wore a threadbare suit that had been carefully pressed, and when he saw Mabel, his face broke into a warm smile. Quote 10, he said, and embraced her carefully, as if afraid she might break. Quote 11. He brought gifts from the bag, a jar of apple butter, homemade sausages wrapped in wax paper, a woolen scarf in a shade of blue that reminded Mabel of the sky in summer. They rode the streetcar back to Bloomfield, Morton asking questions about the city, commenting on how much it had changed since his father's time. At the apartment, Mabel had prepared the spare bedroom, changing the sheets and placing fresh towels on the dresser. Morton seemed genuinely touched. "You didn't have to go to such trouble," he said, but Mabel brushed off his protests. "Your family," she said simply. The first weeks were wonderful. Morton helped Mabel with household chores she'd struggled with since Howard died, changing light bulbs, moving furniture, carrying groceries up the stairs. He did the shopping, standing in ration lines at the grocery store so Mabel didn't have to. He cooked meals, simple but hearty, pot roasts, stews, cornbread. The neighbors noticed and approved. Mrs. Kowalski from downstairs stopped Mabel in the hallway one day and said, "You're so lucky, having family come take care of you. My son's in France, and who knows when I'll see him again." But after 6 weeks, something shifted. It was subtle at first. Morton began talking about the apartment, making observations about the building, the neighborhood, the value of property in Pittsburgh. One evening in late June, as they sat drinking coffee after dinner, Morton broached the subject directly. He explained to Mabel that at her age, it was dangerous to be the sole owner of property. "What if something happens to you?" he asked, his voice full of concern. "What if you fall or get sick and can't manage your affairs? The city could seize the apartment for unpaid taxes or put it up for sale. You could end up in a county home." Mabel felt a cold prickle of fear. She'd heard stories about the county home, about elderly people dying there alone and forgotten. Quote, 17, she asked. Morton leaned forward, taking her hand. Quote, 18. His eyes were sincere, his voice gentle. Mabel wanted to believe him. She'd been alone for so long, and here was someone who seemed to genuinely care. But she hesitated. The apartment was all she had, the only thing left from her life with Howard. "I need to think about it," she said. Morton didn't press. He simply nodded and changed the subject. But over the next weeks, he returned to the topic again and again, always gently, always with apparent concern. He pointed out how difficult it was for her to manage the stairs, how the building was deteriorating, how property taxes were rising. Quote, 20, quote, he said. Quote, 21, quote. Finally, worn down by his persistence and frightened by his warnings, Mabel agreed. At the end of July 1944, they went together to the office of a notary public on Penn Avenue. Morton had already prepared the deed of gift. Mabel signed where he showed her, her hand shaking slightly. The notary, a bored-looking man in shirt sleeves, stamped the document and filed it. The apartment on Liberty Avenue now belonged to Morton Cordwell. Morton was jubilant. On the way home, he bought Mabel an ice cream cone, talking about how relieved he was that she was protected now, how he would take care of everything. But after the paperwork was filed at the county recorder's office, Morton began to change. It happened gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. He became less attentive, less warm. He stopped asking about her day or listening when she talked. When she asked him questions, he answered in monosyllables or not at all. By mid-August, the change was undeniable. Morton became irritable and short-tempered. He snapped at Mabel over small things: a dish left in the sink, a window left open, a radio turned up too loud. He forbade her from inviting the neighbor women she'd been friends with for years. When Mrs. Kowalski knocked on the door one afternoon to invite Mabel to a church social, Morton answered and told her coldly that Mabel was too tired for visitors and wouldn't be going out. Mrs. Kowalski left looking confused and hurt.
"Why did you do that?" Mabel asked after the door closed.
"I wanted to go." Morton turned on her, his face hard. "Those women don't care about you. They gossip and pry. They're jealous because you have family and they don't. They just want to know what you've got so they can find ways to take it." His voice was sharp, cutting. Mabel tried to protest, but Morton raised his hand dismissively. "I'm protecting you, whether you understand it or not." Mabel fell silent, suddenly afraid. Then he began controlling her money. Mabel's pension, $38 a month from Howard's railroad benefits, had always come to her in a check that she cashed at the bank. In September, Morton announced that he'd gone to the pension office and arranged for the checks to be issued in his name instead, since he was now responsible for the household. Quote, 26, quote, he said. Quote, 27, quote, Mabel protested. Quote, 28, quote. Morton's face darkened. "And now I'm working to take care of you. Or would you rather go to the county home?" The threat hung in the air. Mabel backed down. Morton gave her $3 a week for incidentals, church collection, a newspaper, small personal items. The rest, he said, went to groceries, utilities, and building maintenance. But Mabel couldn't understand where the money was going. Before Morton arrived, she'd lived comfortably on the pension, even managing to save a little each month. Now there was never anything left. The food changed, too. Morton stopped buying the cuts of meat Mabel liked, the fresh vegetables, the eggs and butter. Instead, he brought home day-old bread from the bakery's discount bin, bruised apples and carrots, the cheapest cuts of meat, mostly gristle and bone. Fresh milk was replaced with powdered. Butter disappeared entirely, replaced by margarine so cheap it barely had any taste. Mabel began losing weight. Her dresses, already loose, hung on her frame like sacks. She felt weak, dizzy when she stood up too quickly. Quote, 30, quote. She told Morton one evening in late September. Quote, 31, quote. Morton looked up from his newspaper. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 32, underscore, underscore. He returned to his reading, dismissing her. The worst began in October. Mabel's blood pressure, which had always been slightly elevated, spiked dangerously. She woke one morning with a pounding headache, her vision blurry, her heart racing. She managed to get dressed and walk to the clinic 3 blocks away, where Dr. Stern, who'd been treating her for years, took one look at her and ordered her to sit down immediately. He took her blood pressure twice, frowning at the reading. He wrote out a prescription and handed it to her. At the pharmacy, Mabel learned that the medication would cost $6. She had only $2 in her purse from the weekly allowance Morton gave her. She went home and asked Morton for the money. He was sitting in Howard's old chair, reading the sports section. $6 for pills? He said, not looking up. That's robbery. These doctors and pharmacists, they're all in it together. They see an old woman and they smell money. You don't need expensive medicine. You need rest and some common sense. But Dr. Stern said it's dangerous. He said I could have a stroke. Morton finally looked at her, his eyes cold. Doctors always say things are dangerous. That's how they make money, scaring people. You want to waste money on pills that probably don't even work? Go ahead, but I'm not paying for it. The money goes to keeping a roof over our heads and food on the table. That's what's important. But it's my money, from Howard's pension. Morton stood up slowly. Your money? His voice was quiet but menacing. You signed the apartment over to me. You agreed I would manage the finances. If you don't like how I'm doing it, maybe you should find somewhere else to live. I'm sure the county home would take you. Mabel backed away, frightened by the look in his eyes. She went to her room and closed the door, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. She lay on her bed trying to calm down, but her head throbbed and her vision swam with dark spots. Over the next days, her condition worsened. The headaches became constant. She felt nauseated, exhausted. Her hands shook. Several times she felt faint and had to sit down suddenly to keep from falling. Morton noticed but said nothing. He watched her struggle with an expression that Mabel couldn't read, something between indifference and calculation. One night in early November, unable to sleep because of the pain in her head, Mabel lay in bed thinking about her situation. Morton had her apartment. He had her pension. He controlled her food, her money, her contact with the outside world. And now he was refusing to let her have medicine she desperately needed. Why? What did he gain by keeping her sick? And then it struck her, a realization so terrible that she gasped aloud in the dark room. He was waiting for her to die. Once she was dead, he would have everything. The apartment, any savings she had, even her few pieces of jewelry. And without medicine, weakened by poor food and stress, she wouldn't last long. A stroke, a heart attack, an infection, any of these could kill her, and who would question it? She was 71 years old. Old people died. It would be seen as natural. But would it be? Mabel forced herself to think clearly despite the pain and fear. If Morton was planning this, if he was deliberately letting her die, then who was he really? She'd never questioned his story, never verified it. She'd been so desperate for family, so lonely, that she'd accepted everything he told her without proof. She got out of bed, moving slowly in the darkness, and found the tin box where she kept important papers. In the moonlight from the window, she looked through them. Her birth certificate from 1873. Her parents' names, Walter Cordwell and Ida Cordwell. Walter's death certificate from 1918. Her mother had died in 1932. She remembered clearly what her mother had told her. Walter had been an only child. His parents, Samuel and Rebecca, had tried for years to have more children but never could. Walter was alone. If Walter had no brothers, then Eugene Cordwell never existed. And if Eugene never existed, then Morton couldn't be his son. Morton couldn't be her cousin. Everything he'd told her was a lie. Mabel sat on her bed, shaking with fear and rage. She'd been deceived, robbed, and was now being slowly killed by a stranger who'd pretended to be family. But what could she do? Morton controlled everything. She had no money, no way to leave, no one to turn to. The neighbors thought Morton was a devoted relative. The pension office had transferred her benefits to him. The apartment was legally his. Then she remembered something Mrs. Kowalski had mentioned months ago. A young woman lawyer who helped people who couldn't afford fancy attorneys. What was her name? Breslow. Vivian Breslow. Mrs. Kowalski had said her office was downtown near the courthouse. Mabel didn't sleep that night. She lay in the dark, planning. She would need to get out of the apartment without Morton knowing where she was going. She would need to reach this lawyer. It was her only hope. The next morning, Mabel told Morton she needed to go to the church to drop off some knitting she'd done for the Red Cross. It was a lie. She hadn't knitted anything in weeks, didn't have the strength. But Morton barely looked up from his breakfast. Quote, _42 ___, he said. Mabel walked carefully down the stairs, holding the railing tightly. On the street, she stopped Mrs. Kowalski, who was sweeping her front steps. Quote, 43, quote. Mrs. Kowalski looked concerned. Quote, 44, quote. Quote, 45, quote, 46, quote. Mabel was already walking away, moving as fast as her shaky legs would carry her. She took the streetcar downtown, counting out the nickels from the small amount of money she'd hidden in her coat pocket. At the Allegheny building, she climbed the 4 flights of stairs, stopping twice to catch her breath and wait for the dizziness to pass. On the 4th floor, she found the door with the brass nameplate. She went in without knocking, her heart hammering. A young woman with dark hair pinned up looked up from a desk covered in papers. This was Vivian Breslow. Mabel's vision blurred with tears of relief and fear. She'd made it this far. Now she had to make this woman understand. She fumbled in her purse for the piece of paper she'd prepared, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold it. On it, she'd written just 3 words. He'll kill me. Now, sitting in Vivian's office with a cup of coffee warming her hands, Mabel told the whole story. Vivian listened without interrupting, making notes on a yellow legal pad. When Mabel finished, Vivian was quiet for a moment, thinking. Quote, 48, quote, she finally said. Quote, 49, quote. Mabel nodded. Quote, 50, quote. She handed over the tin box. Vivian examined the contents carefully. The birth certificates, death certificates, marriage license. Everything was there. Vivian said. Mabel thought. Vivian said firmly. She picked up the telephone and dialed. After a brief conversation, she hung up and turned to Mabel. Vivian grabbed her coat and hat, locked her office, and helped Mabel down the stairs. They took a taxi to the north side. Vivian insisted on paying, and pulled up in front of a narrow brick house on Brighton Road. A woman in her 50s answered the door, her face kind but no nonsense. Vivian said. The woman, who introduced herself as Helen Garrett, nodded. Mabel wanted to cry with relief. For the first time in months, she felt safe. That same afternoon, Vivian went to the Allegheny County Courthouse. She spent 3 hours in the records room, pulling land records and vital statistics going back to the 1860s. The 1869 birth record for Walter Cordwell showed his parents as Samuel Cordwell and Rebecca Cordwell, with a notation. __, quote, _62 __. There were no records of any other children born to Samuel and Rebecca. Walter had been an only son. Vivian sent a telegram to the Dauphin County Courthouse in Harrisburg, requesting records of anyone named Eugene Cordwell, born between 1865 and 1875. The response came 3 days later. No such person existed. The Cordwell surname appeared only twice in Dauphin County records during that period, both unrelated to the Pittsburgh Cordwells. Morton Cordwell was a fraud. But who was he really? Vivian needed to find out, and she needed to know if there were other victims. She contacted the Pittsburgh Police Department and asked to speak with Detective Frank Gallagher. Gallagher was a veteran detective in his early 40s, with a weathered face that had seen too much of human nature's dark side. He'd worked with Vivian on 2 previous cases and respected her thoroughness. She laid out everything in his office, Mabel's story, the documents, her findings from the courthouse. Gallagher listened, his expression growing grimmer. Elder fraud, he said when she finished. We see it sometimes, but usually it's petty stuff. Someone stealing from a parent, a caregiver helping themselves to a bank account. This sounds more organized. Let's pull what we have on this Morton Cordwell. They found a registration card at the Central Police Station. Morton Cordwell, born 1898 in Harrisburg, currently residing at Mabel's address on Liberty Avenue. Occupation listed as __, quote, _65 __. Nothing unusual. But when Gallagher sent inquiries to Harrisburg, the picture changed. The Harrisburg police confirmed that a Morton Cordwell lived there, but he was still employed as a warehouse clerk at a lumber company. He'd never worked at a defense plant and had never been laid off. The man had registered addresses in multiple Pennsylvania cities over the past 6 years. Reading in 1938, Lancaster in 1940, Altoona in 1941, Erie in 1943, Johnstown earlier in 1944. Each time he stayed only a few months before moving on. He's traveling, Gallagher said, studying the list. Following some kind of pattern. Let's check these cities, see if there were similar cases. Vivian and Gallagher sent inquiries to police departments in all 5 cities. Then, they waited. The responses came back over the next 3 weeks, and what they revealed was horrifying. Reading, February 1939. An 83-year-old widow named Esther Grimm had died of pneumonia in her home. 6 months before her death, a man claiming to be her nephew, one Chester Grimm from Scranton, had moved in with her. He'd convinced her to sign over her house to him for quote, _68 _. When Esther died, Chester had sold the house for $800 and disappeared. Neighbors had been suspicious, but the death certificate said pneumonia, and the deed transfer was legal. The local police had opened an investigation, but closed it when they couldn't find Chester Grimm. No such person existed in Scranton. Lancaster, February 1941. 76-year-old Floyd Hutchins, a retired rail yard worker, had died in his home of what the coroner called heart failure brought on by malnutrition and general decline. 8 months before his death, a man calling himself Raymond Hutchins had shown up, claiming to be Floyd's cousin from Wilkes-Barre. Raymond had convinced Floyd to sign over his house and had gradually isolated him from neighbors and friends. After Floyd's death, Raymond sold the house and left town. The Lancaster police had looked for Raymond Hutchins in Wilkes-Barre but found no trace of him. Altoona, October 1941. An elderly woman named Pearl Morrison had nearly lost her home to a man claiming to be her late husband's nephew. Only the intervention of Pearl's daughter, who lived in Philadelphia and visited unexpectedly, had stopped the fraud. The supposed nephew, who called himself Thomas Morrison, had fled before police could arrest him. Pearl died 2 months later, and the case was closed. Erie, August 1943. 70-year-old Cora Pendleton, a seamstress, had signed over her house and her life savings, nearly $400, to someone calling himself Douglas Pendleton, who claimed to be her late husband's nephew from Buffalo. Douglas had lived with Cora for 5 months, during which time she'd lost 30 pounds and become increasingly frail. When neighbors finally contacted the police, Douglas had already left town with Cora's money. Cora had survived but ended up in the county poorhouse. She died there 6 months later. Johnstown, April 1944. An 81-year-old man named Herman Voigt had signed over his small house to someone calling himself Carl Voigt, supposedly Herman's cousin from Ohio. Carl had lived with Herman for 2 months, then left abruptly. Herman died 3 weeks later. The local authorities had investigated but found no Carl Voigt in Ohio and no evidence of foul play in Herman's death. Vivian requested photographs from each police department. When they arrived, she spread them across Gallagher's desk. The images were blurry and faded, taken by witnesses or found in the victims' homes, but the face was unmistakable. Chester Grimm, Raymond Hutchins, Thomas Morrison, Douglas Pendleton, Carl Voigt. All of them were the same man. All of them were Morton Cordwell. Gallagher said quietly. Vivian felt sick. 3 people, Esther, Floyd, and Cora, had died as a direct result of Morton's actions. Pearl had nearly been victimized. Herman had died shortly after Morton left. And now, Mabel. 6 victims in 6 years, moving methodically from city to city, always using the same pattern. Find a lonely elderly person, pose as a long-lost relative, gain their trust, take their property, then either wait for them to die or disappear with whatever he could steal. We need to arrest him, Vivian said. Today, before he realizes Mabel is gone and runs. Gallagher made a phone call to the district attorney's office. An hour later, Vivian and Gallagher sat in the office of Assistant DA Lawrence Kincaid, a sharp-eyed prosecutor in his mid-30s who'd built a reputation for winning difficult cases. Vivian presented everything. Mabel's testimony, the documentary evidence, the pattern of fraud across Pennsylvania. Kincaid listened carefully, occasionally asking questions. When Vivian finished, he was quiet for a moment, then said, quote, 74, quote, 75. Vivian asked. Kincaid smiled grimly, quote, 76, quote. On November 20th, 1944, Detective Gallagher and 2 uniformed officers went to Mabel's apartment on Liberty Avenue. They knocked on the door at 3 in the afternoon. Morton opened it, dressed in shirt sleeves, a newspaper in his hand. When Gallagher showed his badge and announced they had a warrant for his arrest, Morton's face went blank. Quote, 77, quote, he asked calmly. Quote, 78, quote. For just a moment, something flickered in Morton's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or calculation. Then his face smoothed into an expression of bemused innocence. I have no idea what you're talking about. I've done nothing wrong. I want a lawyer. You'll get one, Gallagher said. Let's go. They handcuffed him and led him down the stairs. Neighbors watched from doorways, shocked. Mrs. Kowalski stood on the first-floor landing, her hand over her mouth. As Morton was put into the police car, he looked up at the building, his face expressionless. And then he smiled, a cold, empty smile that made Gallagher's skin crawl. The trial began in March 1945. By then, the war in Europe was in its final weeks, and Pittsburgh's newspapers were full of stories about Allied advances into Germany. But the case of Morton Cordwell, the cousin killer, as the press had dubbed him, captured the city's attention. The courtroom was packed every day of the 2-week trial. Prosecutor Kincaid built his case methodically. He presented documents showing Morton's movements across Pennsylvania, registrations under different names in different cities. He called witnesses from Reading, Lancaster, Erie, and Johnstown, neighbors who'd seen the victims deteriorate under Morton's care, officials who'd processed the suspicious property transfers, doctors who testified about the victims' declining health. He brought in handwriting experts who compared signatures on deeds and wills, showing that several had been forged or signed under duress. He presented financial records showing that Morton had sold 4 houses and pocketed thousands of dollars over 6 years. Most powerfully, he called Mabel Cordwell. She'd spent the past 4 months at Helen Garrett's boarding house, eating regular meals and taking the medicine Dr. Stern had prescribed. She'd regained some weight and color, though she still looked fragile. She wore her best dress and walked to the witness stand with her head high. For 3 hours, she testified. She described how lonely she'd been after Howard's death, how she'd placed the advertisement seeking family, how Morton's letters had seemed like an answer to a prayer. She described his kindness in the beginning, then the gradual change, the control, the intimidation, the starvation, the refusal to let her have medicine. When she described the moment she realized he was waiting for her to die, her voice broke, and the courtroom was absolutely silent. Kincaid asked, Mabel said quietly. Morton's defense attorney, a court-appointed lawyer named Herbert Moss, tried to suggest that Mabel had been mentally incompetent, that she'd given Morton the apartment willingly, that he'd acted in good faith. But Mabel was sharp and clear in her answers, and Moss's efforts fell flat. Morton himself refused to testify, sitting at the defense table with an expression of bored disdain. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. They found Morton Cordwell guilty on 4 counts of fraud, 3 counts of theft, and 2 counts of criminally negligent homicide in the deaths of Esther Grimm and Floyd Hutchins. Judge Horace Blackwell, a stern man in his 60s with a reputation for harsh sentences, didn't hesitate. "Mr. Cordwell," he said, "you are a predator who targeted the most vulnerable members of our society. You exploited their loneliness, stole their property, and in at least 2 cases that we know of, caused their deaths through deliberate neglect. This court sentences you to 25 years in the state penitentiary at Rockview. May God have mercy on your soul, because this court has none." As Morton was led away in handcuffs, he turned and looked directly at Mabel, who sat in the front row. For just a moment, his mask slipped, and she saw pure hatred in his eyes. But Mabel met his gaze steadily, without flinching. She had survived. She had won. After the trial, Vivian worked with the county to void the fraudulent deed. The apartment was returned to Mabel's name. The pension checks were redirected to her. Vivian also connected her with a church group that provided regular visits and assistance to elderly people. Real help, from people who asked for nothing in return. But Vivian couldn't stop thinking about the case. During the trial, Kincaid had mentioned that cases like this were probably happening all over the country, but going unnoticed because the victims were isolated, the deaths seemed natural, and the perpetrators moved on before anyone connected the dots. How many Mortons were out there? How many Mabels were suffering in silence? The war had created an epidemic of loneliness. Millions of men were overseas. Women had left their hometowns to work in factories. Families were scattered. And elderly people, widows and widowers, childless couples, those who'd outlived their families, were especially vulnerable. The traditional support systems had broken down. Churches and community organizations were overwhelmed, and predators like Morton were exploiting it. In June 1945, just days after VE Day, Vivian drafted a proposal. She called it the Elder Defense Initiative. The concept was simple: create a network of volunteer attorneys willing to provide free or reduced-cost legal services to elderly clients, particularly in cases involving fraud, exploitation, or abuse. The initiative would maintain a registry of vulnerable seniors, work with police to identify patterns of elder abuse, and advocate for legal protections. She presented the proposal to the Allegheny County Bar Association at their monthly meeting. The response was mixed. Some older attorneys dismissed it as unnecessary do-gooder work that wasn't proper legal practice. "We're lawyers, not social workers," one man said dismissively. But others, particularly younger attorneys returning from the war, were enthusiastic. One of them was Carl Zimmerman, a Marine Corps veteran who'd fought in the Pacific and come home to find that his grandmother in Philadelphia had lost her home to a con artist while he was away. Quote, 89. Quote, he said after the meeting. Quote, 90. Quote. Another volunteer was Ruth Kowalski, one of the few other female attorneys in Pittsburgh. She'd seen her elderly father nearly lose his house to a smooth-talking salesman who'd convinced him to take out a second mortgage. Quote, 91. Quote, she said. Quote, 92. Quote. By September 1945, the initiative had 15 volunteer attorneys. They rented a small office in the Liberty Building, just 2 rooms, furnished with donated desks and filing cabinets, and put up a sign. Quote, 93. They publicized their services through churches, settlement houses, community centers, and the newspapers. The response was overwhelming. Within the first month, they received 47 requests for help. Some were straightforward. Elderly people worried about unfair evictions, predatory door-to-door salesmen, confusing contracts. Others were more serious. In October, they uncovered a ring of con artists selling fake war bonds to war widows. In November, they stopped a landlord from evicting an 80-year-old tenant so he could flip the building for profit. But the case that proved the initiative's value came in December 1945. A woman named Dorothy Haynes, 78 years old, walked into their office with her daughter Claire. Dorothy had been visited by a man claiming to be from the Veterans Administration. He'd told her that her late husband's military pension benefits needed to be restructured under new post-war regulations, and she needed to sign papers immediately or lose her payments. Dorothy had been a war widow since 1919. Her husband had died of influenza after returning from France, and she'd been receiving pension payments for 26 years. The money was her only income. Confused and frightened, she'd been about to sign when Claire, who worked as a secretary downtown, became suspicious. Claire had called the real VA office and learned that no restructuring was happening and no VA representatives were making house calls. Vivian recognized the scam immediately. She contacted Gallagher, who was now heading a special fraud unit at the police department. They set up a sting. When the fake VA agent returned to Dorothy's house for the signed documents, police were waiting. The man, who'd been using the name Walter Sterling, was arrested on the spot. Investigation revealed he was part of a 4-person crew that had been targeting war widows across Allegheny, Beaver, and Westmoreland counties. They'd stolen an estimated $15,000 in pension payments from at least 30 women before being caught. All 4 were convicted and sentenced to prison. The case made headlines. The Pittsburgh Press ran a feature story about Vivian and the Elder Defense Initiative, titled __quote _ 95 __. Donations poured in, $5 here, $10 there, from people who'd been helped or who wanted to support the work. More attorneys volunteered. By early 1946, they had 25 lawyers on their roster. As the organization grew, Vivian began to see patterns. Most of the perpetrators were men, usually middle-aged, who specifically targeted elderly women. They used variations of the same tactics: claim family connection, gain trust, isolate the victim from friends and neighbors, take control of finances, then either wait for death or disappear with whatever they could steal. The victims were almost always people who'd placed advertisements seeking connection in newspapers, church bulletins, veterans organizations. The perpetrators watched these notices like hunters watching for prey. In 1947, the initiative formally incorporated as a nonprofit organization called Elder Shield. By then, they had 42 volunteer attorneys across Pennsylvania and had helped more than 200 elderly people. They'd assisted in the prosecution of 12 different fraud cases, recovering over $30,000 in stolen property and money. Vivian, now 30 years old, found herself becoming a recognized expert in elder law. She was invited to speak at law schools, bar association meetings, and social work conferences. In one of these talks, at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law in 1948, she met a young law student named Judith Crane. Judith approached her after the lecture, her eyes blazing with determination. She told Vivian about her grandfather in Philadelphia, a retired pharmacist who'd been swindled out of his life savings by a fake insurance agent. The family had managed to recover some of the money, but her grandfather had died shortly after, broken by the shame of having been duped. "I want to do what you're doing," Judith said. "I want to stop these people. Can you help me start something in Philadelphia?" Vivian smiled. "Yes, let's talk." Within a year, Elder Shield had opened a Philadelphia office with Judith running it. The model was replicable. Find volunteer attorneys, secure a small office, publicize services, work closely with police and social services. By 1950, Elder Shield had offices in Harrisburg and Scranton. By 1953, they'd expanded into Ohio and West Virginia. As the organization grew, Vivian increasingly focused on systemic reform. Individual cases were important, but she wanted to change the laws that made elderly people vulnerable in the first place. She worked with state legislators to draft new protections. In 1951, Pennsylvania passed the Elder Property Protection Act, which Vivian had helped write. The law required that any property transfer involving someone over 70 must be witnessed by 2 people and notarized, with a mandatory 10-day waiting period before the transfer took effect. This gave families and authorities time to intervene if fraud was suspected. The law also made it a felony to financially exploit someone over 65. Vivian had testified before the state Senate committee that drafted the law. She'd brought Mabel Cordwell with her. Now 80 years old but still sharp, Mabel told her story to the legislators. When she finished, There wasn't a dry eye in the room. The law passed unanimously. By 1955, Elder Shield had offices in 12 states and had assisted over 1,500 clients. Vivian was 37 now, managing a staff of 8 full-time employees and coordinating with more than 200 volunteer attorneys. The organization had prevented millions of dollars in fraud and had helped convict dozens of con artists. But Vivian never forgot where it started. She kept a copy of Mabel's original note, "He'll kill me," framed on her office wall, a reminder of why this work mattered. Mabel Cordwell lived until 1959, dying peacefully at age 86 in her Liberty Avenue apartment. She left the apartment to Elder Shield in her will. It became their Pittsburgh headquarters, with a bronze plaque by the front door. Mabel Cordwell House, in memory of a woman whose courage saved countless others. Morton Cordwell remained in Rockview Penitentiary. He petitioned for parole in 1952, claiming rehabilitation. Elder Shield submitted a detailed opposition brief documenting his crimes, and parole was denied. He petitioned again in 1957, again denied. In 1962, at age 64, Morton died in the prison infirmary from complications of diabetes. No one claimed his body. He was buried in the prison cemetery in an unmarked grave. But even in death, Morton's shadow lingered. In 1960, Vivian received a letter from California. It was from a woman named Margaret Cordwell, who identified herself as Morton's daughter. Margaret explained that she'd been conceived before Morton began his criminal career, and her mother had left him when Margaret was 3 years old. She'd grown up knowing nothing about her father except that he was gone. Only recently, after her mother's death, had Margaret found old letters and learned what her father had become. She was writing to apologize and to provide information that might help prevent others from following his path. Margaret wrote, Vivian immediately contacted federal law enforcement. The FBI located Leonard Voss in Sacramento, California, where he was living under the name Leonard Fisher. He'd recently convinced an elderly widow to sign over her house. Investigation revealed he'd been running similar scams across California, Nevada, and Oregon for years, using methods identical to Morton's. Voss was arrested, tried, and convicted. At his trial, he admitted that he and Morton had worked together in Pennsylvania in the early 1930s, targeting elderly people. They'd refined the technique together before going their separate ways. Voss testified, showing no remorse. The case reinforced something Vivian had suspected. This wasn't just individual criminals acting independently. It was a criminal trade, with techniques passed from person to person like any other skill. And that meant it would never completely stop. She began advocating for better information sharing between law enforcement agencies across state lines. Working with the FBI, she helped establish a national registry of convicted elder fraud offenders in 1962. The registry allowed police departments to check whether someone had committed similar crimes elsewhere, making it harder for perpetrators to simply move to a new city and start over. Elder Shield continued to expand. By 1970, it operated in 30 states with more than 500 volunteer attorneys. They'd assisted over 8,000 clients and had been instrumental in dozens of criminal prosecutions. Vivian, now 52, stepped down as executive director, but remained on the board of directors. The organization's new director was Judith Crane, who'd started the Philadelphia office 22 years earlier. Under Judith's leadership, Elder Shield modernized. They opened telephone hotlines for reporting suspected fraud, created educational programs to teach elderly people how to recognize scams, and began publishing a newsletter with fraud alerts. In 1973, Vivian was awarded the Presidential Citizens Medal by President Nixon for her work protecting vulnerable Americans. The ceremony in Washington was attended by dozens of people whose lives had been saved by Elder Shield. People who would have lost everything if not for Vivian's determination to help one frightened old woman in 1944. But Vivian's proudest moment came in 1975, at a conference in Chicago. During the reception, a young social worker approached her, tears in her eyes. "Mrs. Breslow," the woman said, "I just wanted to thank you. My grandmother was helped by Elder Shield in 1959. Someone was trying to steal her home in Baltimore, and your lawyers stopped it. She lived another 12 years because of that. She got to see me graduate from college. She got to meet my children, all because someone cared enough to help her. Vivian felt her own eyes fill with tears. This was why she'd done it. Not for medals or recognition, but for moments like this. For grandmothers who got to see their grandchildren grow up. For elderly people who got to live their final years with dignity and security. By 1985, Elder Shield had assisted over 25,000 people. Vivian was 67 and had been fully retired for a decade, though she still consulted occasionally. That year, the organization commissioned a study to measure its impact. The researchers estimated that Elder Shield had prevented approximately $18 million in fraud and had contributed to the conviction of more than 300 criminals. But more than the numbers, Vivian treasured the letters, hundreds of them, from people who'd been helped, from families grateful that their loved ones had been protected, from young attorneys inspired to enter elder law because of Elder Shield's example. One letter, received in 1986, came from Montana. The writer was Eugene Cordwell, the real Eugene Cordwell, the actual son of Samuel Cordwell's brother who died young in 1905. Eugene explained that he'd only recently learned about the case that had started Elder Shield. My father James was Walter Cordwell's younger brother, Eugene wrote. He died in a mining accident when I was 2 years old. I never knew my Uncle Walter. He'd already passed when I was born. But I wanted you to know that the real Cordwell family is grateful for what you did. You protected our name. You got justice for Cousin Mabel. And you saved so many others. Thank you. Vivian kept that letter on her desk until her death in 1998, at age 80. By then, Elder Shield had grown into one of the nation's premier organizations fighting elder abuse and fraud. It operated in all 50 states, had a permanent staff of over 200, and coordinated thousands of volunteer attorneys. At Vivian's funeral, Judith Crane, now 72 and herself retired, gave the eulogy. She spoke about how one person's decision to help had rippled outward across decades and across the country, protecting people who would never know Vivian's name, but whose lives were better because of her. Vivian Breslow could have turned Mabel Cordwell away, Judith said. She could have said the case was too complicated, too risky, too unlikely to succeed. But she didn't. She listened to a frightened old woman. She believed her, and she fought for her. That's the legacy. That's what we're called to continue. Elder Shield continues its work today. Modern con artists use new technologies, phone scams, internet fraud, identity theft. But the fundamental pattern remains the same. They target the lonely, the vulnerable, the people who desperately want connection and are willing to trust. And there are still attorneys, social workers, and volunteers who stand ready to defend them, carrying forward the mission that began in a Pittsburgh office on a November day in 1944, when an old woman handed a young lawyer a note that said, "He'll kill me." And that young lawyer said, "Not if I can stop him."